First, welcome everyone to the first event in the Yale Lectures in Medieval Studies Fall 2020 series. We are very glad that you are able to join us today, albeit remotely. This is the first time that YLMS has hosted a virtual lecture, so please bear with us. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Carson Kepke, and I'm in the Medieval Studies program here at Yale. I'm serving as co-chair of the series, and we'll be introducing today's guest speaker. But before I do, I would first like to thank our generous sponsors, without whose support we would not be able to invite such distinguished speakers from across the country and around the world. Our sponsors include the Archaea program, the Macmillan Center, the Institute of Sacred Music, the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, the Divinity School, and the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences Dean's Fund. I would also like to thank my fellow committee members for their help organizing this event and those to come. They are Larissa Tsukamoto, Theo Breen, Rachel Wilson, and Shahruz Khalifian. Finally, I would like to acknowledge that Yale University stands upon the traditional homeland of the Quinnipiac people who were dispossessed of their lands. Now, I am honored to introduce our speaker, Dr. Mark Chinca, who serves as reader in medieval and early modern German literature in Cambridge University's Faculty of Modern and Medieval Languages and Linguistics. His work focuses on medieval and early modern German and comparative literature. He is the author of numerous articles, book chapters, and 3 books: History Fiction Verisimilitude, Gottfried von Strassburg, Tristan, and the newly released Meditating Death in Medieval and Early Modern Devotional Writing from Bonaventure to Luther, which just came out in 2020. It is a study of death and meditation in Western Christian culture from the 12th to 16th centuries. Since 2012, he has co-led a major international research project on the Kaiserchronik, one of the most extensive and influential vernacular chronicles of the German Middle Ages. A digital edition of all extant manuscripts, manuscript versions rather, of the text was published in 2018. Current projects of his include a multi-author history of the beginnings of vernacular literature in the European Middle Ages. Today, he will be giving a talk entitled Remembering the Last End in the Late Middle Ages, Rhetoric and Composition, which engages with material from his recent book. He was initially scheduled to speak for us in March of this year, but we were unfortunately forced to reschedule due to the coronavirus pandemic. But now Dr. Chinca has generously agreed to join us today remotely from the United Kingdom. Before I yield the floor to him, I would like to let everyone know that we'll be having the lecture, and you are welcome to use the Q&A function, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. After the lecture is finished, we will move to the Q&A session. So please enter your questions by then. You should also be able to upvote questions if you have the same question. And I believe that the same information has been placed in the chat box as well. Okay. Well, without further ado, I will now yield the floor to our honored guest.
Thank you very much, Carson. And just while I'm while I'm getting the PowerPoint up, let me say first of all, just thank you, first of all, for that very kind introduction. Thank you also for the invitation and the renewal of the invitation. It really is a privilege and a pleasure to be talking to you. And last of all, I should thank you all so much for accommodating me in this particular time slot, which I know is not the traditional one for your lectures in medieval studies. What it does mean is that I don't have to give a lecture in pajamas, and I think there's enough about the format today that's new already without adding that particular novelty. That would have been, I know you can minimize me now, but that would have been quite a sight, I think, and probably not one that you wanted to see. Anyway, let's begin. In all thy works remember thy last end, and thou shalt never sin. For well over a millennium, this verse from the Bible had a normative hold on the ascetic and devotional cultures of Latin Christianity. Originating in a collection of Jewish ethical teachings, which found its way into the Christian biblical canon as the Book of Ecclesiasticus, or Wisdom of Sirach, the verse was disseminated in all kinds of format and setting. As a maxim to be learned by pupils in monastery and cathedral schools, it features in Isidore of Seville's sentences. As the text of homilies and sermons preached to lay as well as ecclesiastical audiences, in a letter to a young man imploring him not to study at university because the opportunities worldly learning opens up are vain and sinful. The source of that advice, of course, that's not me. That is Geert Groote, the founder of the Devotio Moderna movement, writing to a young protege in 1382. Finally, it fetches up as a line in a play offering practical theological guidance to a merchant who's worried about how he can continue to make money and still save his soul. The play in question is the play of the dying person. It's a morality of the everyman type performed at Munich in 1510. No matter to whom it's addressed or in what format or context or to what purpose, Sirach's instruction, remember thy last end, requires the addressee to make a double turn. The first turn is a cognitive operation, a turning of mental attention toward the novissima. The word in the Latin Bible literally means the things that are last, and was identified in patristic times with 4 specific last things: death, judgment, hell, and heaven. A 5th last thing, purgatory, was added to the list after the doctrine became official in the 13th century. But well into the early modern period, theology continued to talk about the quatuor novissima, or 4 last things. The cognitive turn toward the novissima was passed out in temporally extended acts of meditation on death and the other last things. These acts of meditation produce the second turn required by the Sirach verse, which isn't cognitive, but moral. Remembering the last end leads to conversion, a turning around of the believer's whole moral habitus by doing penance for past sins and resolving not to repeat them in future. Meditation proceeded from reading, and meditations on mortality and the afterlife were typically programmed by text. Bible text, liturgical text, ready-made meditation texts like the prayers and meditations of Anselm, and especially after the 12th century, devotional guides to meditation. The rhetorical and compositional features of some of these guides are the focus of my talk today. The argument I will be making is that the artificial properties of devotional writing, the rhetoric the authors deploy, the compositional choices they make, are far from merely ornamental or incidental to the content or intended effect of the writing on its readers. I'm of course by no means alone in arguing this kind of line. Recently, both Claire Waters and, closer to home, at least for you, Jessica Brantley, have argued that there is no clear separation in devotional writing between the formal and the propositional, between aesthetics and use. In their case studies, they are concerned with Marian miracles and books of hours, respectively. In my sources, handbooks of eschatological meditation, rhetoric and composition are instrumental in orchestrating the double turn implied in Sirach's instruction always to remember the last end. In the first place, lexical choices made by the writer create a hortatory rhetoric of turning. The recurrence of the verb to turn in all its various derivatives directs the reader to turn her thoughts to her last things and urges her to turn her life around. Second, there's the deployment of enargeia, rhetorically vivid description, to project imaginary landscapes where the reader, in a virtual anticipation of her actual conversion, can picture herself turning. Third and finally, there is the compositional device of textual rhythm created out of repetition, a relentless return of the same exhortations, the same images, the same commonplaces of argument, so that to read the text is to realize the instruction to turn, not just conceptually or in the imagination, but, because rhythm is felt in the body, somatically. I'll be looking at 3 highly influential manuals of spiritual exercise and devotion from the 13th and 14th centuries, and here they are. By Bonaventure, Heinrich Suso, probably better known to you in the anglicised form Heinrich Suso, and Gerard of Vliederhofen. Bonaventure and Suso need no introduction. The third writer, Gerard of Vliederhofen, was an official in the Teutonic Order of Knights, active in the Netherlands in the last quarter of the 14th century. His work, the Cordiale, has been described quite accurately as the standard European treatise of the 4 last things throughout the 15th century. Before looking at these writings in more detail, I want to first say a little about the context from which they arose, because it's essential background for understanding their way of working. The writings in question reflect two developments of great significance for the history of meditating on the last things in Western Christianity. The first is the great dissemination of eschatological knowledge, which began around the turn of the 13th century. As a very broad generalization, we can say that up to the end of the 12th century, knowledge of the last things and how to meditate on them had been the possession of a spiritual elite, monks, bishops, regular canons, and the occasional lay aristocrats with the necessary time, education, and resources to lead a structured life of ascetic devotion. With the so-called pastoral revolution of the 13th century and the rise of the mendicant orders, the ascetic practices of this elite, which included meditation on death and the last things, began to be disseminated to other social groups. The agent of dissemination was text, and that brings me to the other connected development, the increased textual regimentation of meditation. Of course, text, most prominently the text of the Bible or liturgy, had long been used as the basis for making meditations, but the practice relied on readers who had already acquired the necessary techniques through long apprenticeship in what Mary Carruthers has memorably called the craft of thought. She means the techniques developed in monasteries of slow, ruminative reading, whose rules were rarely set down in words, but I quote from Carruthers, must be learned by practicing over and over again, end of quote. The writers I'm concerned with addressed themselves to readers who hadn't necessarily been apprenticed in the monastic craft. Consequently, they required more explicit direction in order to make meditations. Textual instructions provided that direction, and also ensured consistency of practice across time and place, especially important in the new mendicant orders whose members were highly mobile, unlike the traditional Benedictine monk whose vow committed him to stabilitas loci, to always remaining in the same place. The result was a kind of devotional writing style that was far more regulative and directive, since text had to take over the stabilizing functions of long habituation and long habitation in the same community. Nowhere is the hortatory rhetoric of turning more systematically deployed than in Bonaventure's soliloquium on the 4 spiritual exercises. The work is a sequence of 4 meditational exercises intended to lead the person who follows them to a foretaste of eternal happiness in the life to come. Bonaventure wrote the soliloquium sometime after 1257, when he was elected Minister General of the Franciscan Order. In the prologue, he explains that he has expressed himself, quote, in simple words for the sake of every simpler person, end of quote. The formulation suggests he was writing for a public in the various branches of the Franciscan organization. Friars of the so-called First Order, especially the ones without university education, nuns in the Second Order of Poor Clares, clergy and lay people organized in the regular and secular divisions of the Third Order. By the later Middle Ages, the soliloquium was appealing to an audience far beyond the Franciscan movement. Over 250 manuscripts of the Latin text survive, as well as numerous printed editions and translations into German and Dutch. The exercises of the soliloquium are written as dialogues between the anima devota, the God-fearing soul who makes the exercises and is therefore a kind of surrogate for the reader, and the voice of the homo interior, or inner man, who acts as the soul's spiritual director. Appropriating a verse from the Song of Songs in which the speaker exhorts his lover, return, return, O Sulamites, and repeating its imperative revertere a further 18 times. I'll show you the Latin text just so you can see the repetition. There it is. So repeating revertere 19 times overall in that text. The inner man implores the soul made wretched by sin to return to its creator. I'm not going to read the whole quote to you because I think you get the message. You know, it just really does say, lover, come back to me. Turn away from sin, return to God. That's the revertere program. And that's the program of the soliloquium, turn away from sin, return to God. And the spiritual exercises are themselves conceived as a series of cognitive turns, which, if completed, will lead the soul to make the moral turn away from sin and back to God. The God-fearing soul is exhorted by the inner man to turn its ray of contemplation, its radios contemplationis, toward a sequence of themes in a prescribed order. Here they are. In the first 2 turns, inward ad interiora and outward ad exteriora, The objects of contemplation are the soul itself, formed by nature, deformed by sin, reformed by grace, and the misery and mutability of the world. In the following two turns, downward ad inferiora and upward ad superiora, the objects are the traditional four last things of death, judgment, hell, and heaven. The programme of contemplative turns is nevertheless far more complex than it may seem from this passage from the prologue to the soliloquium. In addition to the scheme described there, which prescribes the cognitive turns to be made by the God-fearing soul while it still inhabits the body on earth, there is a second set of cognitive turns. These are performed by those who are already in heaven. In the fourth and last exercise of the soliloquium, which is a meditation on the joys of heaven, the soul turns its ray upward ad superiora to heaven and encounters there a second sequence of contemplative turns. The inner man explains that the inhabitants of the celestial city have their own ray of contemplation, which they also turn in each of four directions. They're listed in the right-hand column of this slide. The numbers show the order of their contemplation, which is slightly different from the one that's given to the meditating soul, but I've reordered them like this so that you can see the parallel. So the inhabitants of the celestial city contemplate the world, sin, and the devil beneath them, infra se. They contemplate the celestial city round about them, juxta se. They contemplate the glory of the resurrection body within them, intra se. And they contemplate God, the summum bonum, above them, supra se. And what you can see from the slide is that the directions are the same as the soul was told to follow at the beginning of its exercises. Juxta se in the heavenly sequence corresponds to ad exteriora in the soul's program. But the order in which they're contemplated is not the same, nor are the objects contemplated by the citizens of heaven identical with the ones that the soul is instructed to consider in the equivalent direction of its exercises. These differences are deliberate and also functional. They serve as a reminder that the perspective of the soul contemplating heaven while still in its mortal body is not the same as the perspective of those who actually dwell in the city of heaven. Nevertheless, the 2 points of view, the earthly and the heavenly, are permitted to merge for a time before they are separated again at the end of the exercise. The soul, having turned its ray of contemplation upward to the joys of the heavenly citizens, is told by the inner man to see and investigate with a devout mind how the divine and celestial spirits who have escaped the peril of this present life and its misery sometimes turn the ray of their contemplation on the things beneath them. When they do this, they rejoice at their liberation from the diabolical and worldly afflictions they see down below. The soul is further instructed to bring this heavenly perspective to mind whenever it encounters temptation or persecution in this life. Thus, the soul not only contemplates others as they contemplate, looking up at the heavenly citizens who look down, the soul is encouraged to look with them to obtain a foretaste of their bliss through a mental reenactment of their downward directed contemplation. The mingling of perspectives continues in the next celestial direction, as the contemplating soul is told to feast its inner eyes, its oculi mentales, on the heavenly delights round about it, juxta te, so it joins the heavenly citizens looking juxta se. It seems, however, that when it comes to copying the heavenly denizens looking within, intra se, the soul no longer sees directly what the citizens of heaven see, since it is merely instructed to consider and reflect on the glory of the resurrection body. The demerging of perspectives becomes clear and categorical in the last direction. Invited by the inner man to consider and observe the beatific vision and the soul of those who gaze into the mirror of eternity above them, supra se, the soul asks the inner man, and what will I see? Et quid videbo? The future tense establishing beyond all doubt that the soul is not looking up into the mirror now in the present of its contemplation. On this side of death, the beatific vision can at most be the object of consideration and observation, not, however, performed or enjoyed. Only in a future turn of the ray of contemplation, to be executed in heaven, will the soul be able to partake immediately of the beatific vision. The turns of the ray performed by the contemplating soul in this life refer to this future turn, whose realization is outside of time, in the life to come. The soliloquium is a text in which the cognitive and moral turns of the instruction, remember thy last end, are encoded primarily in the lexical choices of the author's rhetoric of command and exhortation. My next example, Heinrich Suso's horologium sapientiae, deploys the rhetorical resources of enargeia to create an imaginary space in which the meditating reader may represent to herself the consequences of not turning. The horologium, which dates from the early 1330s, is Suso's own translation of his slightly earlier vernacular devotional treatise, the Little Book of Eternal Wisdom, the Büchlein der ewigen Weisheit. And like the German book, it contains a chapter about the knowledge most useful to mortal man, which is to know how to die. Together with the work that contains it, the chapter became one of the most influential devotional texts of the later Middle Ages. Today, there are over 320 known manuscripts of the horologium, and another 30 or so with the Scire Mori chapter as a self-standing excerpt. There are translations of both the whole work and the chapter into all the major vernaculars of Western Europe. I imagine that the translation best known to many of you will be Thomas Hoccleve's poem Learn to Die, which is a translation of the Suso Scire Mori chapter. Like the rest of the horologium, the chapter is composed as a dialogue between the figure of Sapientia, the personified wisdom of the Holy Scriptures and of God, and her pupil, the Discipulus, who provides a focus of identification for Suso's readers. Instructing her pupil to search the Scriptures, you've got it on the slide, where he will discover how many good things are conferred upon a person by the remembrance of death, Sapientia conjures up the similitude, or the likeness, of a dying youth, who has neglected to remember his last things and must now face the consequences. A further pedagogical dialogue then unfolds between the pupil and this woeful apparition about the necessity of executing a conversio, a conversion or turning. In this dialogue, conversion is initially presented as a temporal problem. In the course of its rhetorical elaboration, however, it is transposed into metaphors and images which figure it as a movement, a turning around in space. The process doesn't stop there, however. As we shall see, Suso pushes the representation beyond the limits of the spatially imaginable so as to create in his readers the terrifying sensation of what it is like to have no place to turn. The pupil, hearing the lamentations of the dying youth, encourages the latter to do penance for his sins and turn to God in time. That's the quote at the top of this slide. Return to your Lord, for he is benign and merciful. This well-intentioned advice only perplexes the dying youth. Does the pupil seriously mean to tell him that he should convert at the last possible minute, he says? His time is already up, the opportunity for penance irrevocably lost. He says, what kind of talk is this? Who are you talking to? I ought to do penance? I ought to convert? And then he regrets, oh, happy penance and timely conversion, for they are free of danger. But whoever commits late to penance will be beset with doubt and uncertainty, because he does not know whether his repentance is genuine or merely a sham. Woe unto me, because I delayed the amendment of my life for so long, that I put off my salvation for so long. How many hours I have lost that will never return. The pupil, on the other hand, still has time, and for that reason the dying youth has some good advice to impart. The pupil should frequently place before his inner eye the mournful apparition of a dying person and ceaselessly recollect this image. In this way, the pupil will make a timely repentance and escape the danger of death taking him by surprise. The disciple takes the message to heart. No sooner is the encounter with the dying youth over than the pupil turns, duly chastened by the experience, to Sapientia and declare, it's at the bottom of the slide, I propose to learn to die. I do not wish to defer penance. I wish to delay my conversion no longer. I am disposed to reform my life without hesitation. The fundamental contrast here is temporal. On the one hand, the pupil who has time to turn his life around. On the other, the dying youth who is out of time. Yet as the vision progresses, the references accumulate to the speaker's freedom or constriction of movement. These references transpose the temporal principle, having or not having time, into spatial terms, having or not having room to turn around. In contrast to the temporal opposition, which is intellectual and abstract, the spatial one is concrete and therefore energetical. Suso's readers can picture a space large enough to accommodate a turn, and also a space too small to turn around in. The pupil always has sufficient room to turn toward his interlocutors. After hearing the dying youth's first speech, he turns to address him. Having heard these words and turned toward him, he said, And at the very end of their conversation, the now tearful pupil turns again, this time to his teacher Sapientia, to give thanks for the lesson and declare his intention to amend his way of life. And having turned in tears toward his Lord, he said, I should explain that because Sapientia also personifies Christ, the wisdom of God, her figure is often gendered masculine, dominus, in the horologium. So the pupil always has room to turn away from and towards his various interlocutors. The youth, on the other hand, who is in the throes of death, is in a suffocatingly constricted space, and these are his spatial quotes. "Oh, how wretched I am," he cries out. "The stings of the most bitter death surround me and seek to suffocate my weak heart. Oh, how my heart is constricted and suffers deadly oppression. The dying youth is captive and shackled. Death, you have encompassed me and bound me with 1,000 bonds. You lead me out with you in iron fetters. Just as fish are caught on the hook and birds trapped in the nets, so have I been taken captive at an ill hour. Oh my God, now I have stumbled into a deep trap. I have fallen headlong into the toils of death. I am bound with the fetters of death." The dying person's scope for turning has been reduced to a single mental operation. The one turn that he makes is the bottom quote here. "I turn my mind's eye to purgatory, where I shall now be taken down." Already at the beginning of the encounter, the youth had presented himself as someone who is surrounded on every side by death. The very first words he utters are from Psalm 17. "Circum dederunt me gemitus mortis, dolores inferi circum dederunt me." The groans of death have encompassed me, the sorrows of hell have encompassed me. These introductory words endow their speaker with a highly ambivalent status. On the one hand, the speaker, the youth, is identical with the personal pronoun me, hence stands in the place of the I, encompassed on all sides. Yet because the lamentations of the youth may also be interpreted as the groans and sorrows of the psalm rendered into articulate human speech, the youth's voice is also the personification of that which causes the I to be encompassed. The likeness of the dying youth, the similitudo mortis, is thus both the one who is surrounded and that which surrounds him. In other words, the youth is a speaking paradox, which it is impossible to locate within the imaginary scenery of the text, with its contrast between room to turn and the spatial constriction of fetters, snares, and encompassment. A surrounding which is also that which it surrounds, the youth's predicament defies spatial visualization altogether. Thus, in spite of the considerable rhetorical resources expended by Suso on representing the likeness of death, the similitudo mortis, in spatially vivid terms, it is a likeness that the reader cannot resolve into a coherent visual phenomenon. If the reader can imagine the dying youth at all, then as an acoustic phenomenon, as a single anguished groaning which emanates from the figure of the dying person, yet sounds from outside and all around it. A groaning that is atopical and consequently untranslatable into any image of captivity or encompassment, but may, as sheer auditory sensation, produce in the virtuality of the reader's meditation the suffocating feeling of what it is like to have no place to turn. The feeling of turning moves from virtuality to being somatic in my third text, the cordiale seu quatuor novissima, the cordial or four last things. This is a collection of homiletic discourses attributed to Gerard of Vliederhofen, written in the northeastern Netherlands at some time in the last quarter of the 14th century. Although little known today, the Latin text is still unedited. The cordiale was among the most important handbooks of eschatological meditation in the 15th century. Over 180 manuscripts and more than 45 early printed editions survive of the Latin work. There are translations into numerous vernaculars, including a late 15th century English translation by Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, printed by Caxton. The title word, cordiale, in medieval Latin means heart tonic or cordial, and the choice of title is explained by the author in a preface which begins with the Syriac verse Memorare novissima tua. Remember thy last end and thou shalt never sin. As Blessed Augustine says in his Book of Meditations, actually it's Anselm's prayers, you ought to avoid the filth of sin more than the excess of torments in hell. Since therefore the knowledge and frequent recollection of the last things call us back from sinning, join us to virtue, keep and confirm us in every good work, I have resolved under the inspiration of divine grace to speak and tell a little of these last things, namely what and how many there are. Since indeed this little work's entire way of proceeding, totalis huius opusculi processus, I'll come back to the word processus, since indeed this little work's entire way of proceeding, its processus, is principally and especially aimed at causing the frequent recollection of the last things to be imprinted ceaselessly on the innermost depths of the human heart, it seems fitting, if it please you, to bestow upon the present little book the title Cordial. The little book consists of 12 homily-like discourses, 3 on each of the 4 last things of death, judgment, hell, and heaven. These discourses are essentially collages of found textual material, sentences, maxims, exemplar that the author has excerpted from the Bible, from patristic and post-patristic authors, as well as from preaching compendia, and fused into a continuous demonstration of whatever proposition is set forth by the discourse's particular title. The first discourse of the work proposes that death causes a person to be humble, quod mors facit hominem se humiliare. I want to look more closely at this discourse with you because the remarkable thing about it is the consistency with which its propositional content, its homiletic intention, and the rhythm of both its argument and the meditation it's intended to inspire are all derived from one and the same principle. That principle is the movement of return. The propositional content is encapsulated in a Bible verse to which the discourse returns over and over. Cursing Adam for eating the forbidden fruit, God tells him that in the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread till thou return to the earth out of which thou wast taken. For dust thou art, and into dust thou shalt return. That's the wording of Jerome's Vulgate Bible. The cordiale author often switches between the Vulgate and the text of the Old Latin Bible, the Vetus Latina, which substitutes earth, terra, for dust in the final sentence, for earth thou art, and into earth thou shalt go. The Genesis verse provides the discourse with a definition of its main topic. Death is the return of the body to the inanimate element from which it was made, the return to the condition of earth or dust before God breathed life into it. You've got the other quote from Genesis book 2. And the Lord God formed the man of the slime of the earth and breathed into his face the breath of life. The definition of death as a return to earth is transferred to the discourse's homiletic intention. The intention is encapsulated in the verb humiliare. The verb meaning to humble, make humble, or abase is related to humus, earth, and means literally bring down to earth. The reader who meditates on the definition of death as a return to earth will herself be returned to earth, and in a double sense. First, the reader recognizes that she too is a mortal being made from earth and destined to return to earth. Second, the acknowledgement of mortality obliges the reader to be humble, as any pride she may take in herself and her achievements is brought back down to earth by the recognition of her mortality. Exactly this double humiliation, or earthing, if you like, of the reader is the intended effect of a longer section of the discourse, in which the author demonstrates the truth of his initial proposition that death makes a person humble through a sequence of citations taken from the Bible, from Augustine, from Bernard of Clairvaux, and from others. This demonstration, which aims at inculcating an attitude of humility, climaxes in an imaginary visit to a graveyard, where the reader is confronted with the brute fact that all human bodies will inevitably be reduced to earth. The physical reduction, return to the earth out of which thou wast taken, is complemented by a linguistic and etymological reduction, as the noun homo, human being, man, is taken back, reduced, returned to its purported etymological root, humus, earth. John Chrysostom says in his little book on the reparation of the lapse, what did it profit those who remained in bodily excess and the pleasures of this life to their very last day? Examine their sepulchres, step up to each one's grave, see only ashes and the foul remains of worms, and remember that this is the body's end. Bernard says in his Meditations, actually it's pseudo-Bernard, nothing has remained of the lovers of this world but ashes and worms. Mark carefully what they are and what they were. They were men just like you. Whatever happened to them can happen to you also. For you are a man from soil, homo de humo, and slime, from slime, limos e limo. You are of earth, you live from earth, and to earth you shall return. At this point, I want to return to the cordiale preface with its reference to this little work's entire way of proceeding, totalis huius opusculi processus. I said I would come back to this. The medieval Latin noun processus means both objectively unfolding progression and consciously adopted procedure. And in the latter meaning, procedure, it can refer to the argument of a written or spoken discourse. Readers of Dante will remember Beatrice's speech in Paradiso 5, where she delivers a reasoned exposition on the nature of vows. Dante thanks her for this speech, which he calls a processo santo, a holy disquisition, so a sort of a speech set, a speech with reasoned sort of exposition. In the context of the cordiale, the phrase totalis huius opusculi processus refers to the rhetorically composed argument of the author's text, its manner of proceeding, but also, I think, to the thought process of the reader who reproduces the compositional procedures of the text virtually in the mental representations of her meditations, and in this way imprints, to take up the metaphor of the preface, the last things in her heart. Both aspects of the cordiale's processus, its compositional structure and the reproduction of that structure in the meditative, immersive reading by the reader, unfold in time and have a rhythm. In the first discourse on death, this rhythm is determined by the proposition humans are made from earth and will return to earth, which returns in ever new variants in the course of the author's exposition. Therefore, who will not be afraid and humble himself, since he knows for certain that he must die presently and return to earth? For there will be no accepting of persons, but it will be just as it was in the beginning. For it is written in the second book of Kings, in the 14th chapter, we all die, and like waters that return no more, we fall down into the earth. Therefore, attend to and consider the beginning of your life, and also its middle and end or termination, and you will find the greatest opportunity and cause for humbling yourself. Whatever you think or say or make of yourself, are you not dust and earth? For it is written in Ecclesiastes in the 12th chapter, before the dust return into its earth from whence it was, into earth most vile, into putrid earth filled with worms. Job chapter 17, I have said to rottenness, thou art my father, to worms, my mother and sister. Likewise, Sirach chapter 17, all men are earth and ashes, and Genesis chapter 3, till thou return to the earth out of which thou wast taken. For dust thou art, and into dust thou shalt return. The discourse ends with a peroration, quoting mainly from the commentary on the book of Job by Peter of Blois. Commenting on a verse from Jeremiah, O earth, 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 hear the words of the Lord, which he relates to Job 1:21, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. Peter explains the threefold repetition of the word earth, terra, as follows. Jeremiah calls man earth 3 times, because man may be called earth in 3 ways. He is earth because he is created from earth. His conversation is on earth. At the end, he returns and is changed to earth. He is earth by his creation, his conversation, and his death. Earth is his nature, his life, his grave. He tastes earth, he licks earth, he thirsts for and desires earth. His belly is cemented fast to the earth. He goes down to the lower depths of the earth, having forgotten celestial things. He goes to law over earth, fights over earth, sails the seas for the sake of earth, circles and goes about the earth for the sake of earth, and for the sake of earth, wretched man, full of fear, labours more frequently, hither and thither, never ceasing from such labours until he who was made from earth reverts to his primal matter, namely earth, saying these words from the 2nd chapter of the 3rd book of Kings, I am going the way of all earth. And therefore, this excerpt then closes with a kind of rhyme. Since we are but dregs and slime, the vilest thing of all, why should we who earth to earth revert walk tall? The concluding rhyme actually is proverbial, it's well attested. The proposition that death is the return of the human person to her primal matter, earth, itself returns over and over, and imparts a rhythm to the argumentative processus of the discourse on the humiliating effects of death. The consequence is that the reader who reproduces the same processus in her meditation will experience a discourse about return as return, because her meditative experience will also have the rhythm of a repeated return to one or other variation of the proposition, death is the return of earth to earth. Moreover, the return is not only to what the meditator has read before, this Genesis verse that just keeps coming up, it's also a return to what she was before, to the earth that she was made from before she began to breathe, and that she will become once more when she is dead. To read the first discourse of the cordiale meditatively is therefore not merely to meditate, concentrate the mind on the topic of death. It is to premeditate, rehearse in the virtuality of meditation, the process of dying. And it's a rehearsal that is as somatic as it is conceptual or imaginary. The knowledge that death is the return of the body to its primal matter is felt by the reader in her body as the insistent rhythm of the recurring statement, for earth thou art, and into earth thou shalt go. What the reader performs in her meditation, a sensual realization of the text's main principle of composition, simultaneously informs her, marks her in the innermost depths of her heart with the form of the turns that she should make and will make. I referred at the very beginning to the conjunction of use and aesthetics in devotional writing. Nowhere is it more palpable than here. And if you've made it through the slides this far, thank you so much for listening. This is a question where you can read it about the three living and the three dead, which is often paired with grisly illuminations. I mean, this is a really good question. I mean, this confrontation of the living with the dead, of course, revolves always around this core formula. What we are, you will be. And so it's this confrontation with mortality. Though, in my recollection, what we are as mortal men, it doesn't actually bring up I don't think it generally brings up the Genesis quotes, we are earth and to earth we shall return. But obviously it's the same, it's the same idea. It's the same idea being repeated as this trope in the traditions of the three living and the three dead. And it's true that the texts of the three living and the three dead are very often illustrated. The interesting thing is, the texts that I'm dealing with generally aren't generally. The cordiale is plain text without illustration. It's just pure text. I don't know of any editions or manuscripts out of the ones, early printed editions or manuscripts that I've seen that contain any illustration, apart from some have a kind of frontispiece that depicts a kind of red heart, sort of symbolizing the title, I guess. The horologium itself doesn't contain illustrations. The Büchlein der ewigen Weisheit, the German source text from which Suso translated, of course, is illustrated. Though most of the illustrations accompany a preceding text in Suso's collection of texts, his Vita, there are only a couple that go in, that accompany the text of the Büchlein der ewigen Weisheit, the equivalent of the Horologium Sapientiae, and they don't accompany the death chapter. Bonaventure's soliloquy, so far as I'm aware, is not illustrated at all in any manuscript that I've seen. These are purely textual manifestations, verbal texts, which, though through their use of energeia, conjure mental images very much. There's no doubt about that. Very much they get read into, Suso in particular gets read in the Renaissance. The cordiale doesn't seem to have had much reception after the 15th century. Bonaventure, of course, is read and becomes kind of revived and recycled because he's a very palpable influence on the devotional exercises of the Devotio Moderna. And then, of course, he's very much the model of Ignatius Loyola as well. So transmuted, Bonaventure has this afterlife throughout the early modern period. In the Lutheran tradition, what you find is a complete turning away from this kind of text and any kind of spiritual exercise. It becomes suspicious as a sort of work that might make you holy. What you get instead in Lutheran traditions, you do have a very strong kind of tradition of meditating on the last end, but it's very much Bible focused. The focus is always on picking a single verse from the Bible, what's called a Trostspruch, a consolatory maxim. It's typically a verse from the Bible that assures you of the message of saving grace. I know that my Redeemer liveth is a favorite one. And you are supposed simply to call this to mind whenever you want to think about death. And meditation in the Lutheran tradition is never sort of passed out into a kind of spiritual exercise that goes on over time. The formula is always hear and believe. It's a kind of passive thing that you hear the word and you are transformed then by its believing effects. Then the next question is about metaphysics. How did I arrive at this sort of language as a subject of study? Oh, that could be a long story, I suppose, but I'll try and make it short. How did I came to this topic a long, long time ago, I thought originally I was going to try and work on medieval drama. I wanted to change from I'd worked a lot on courtly romance, and I thought I wanted a complete change. And as I worked on medieval drama, I discovered various dramas about death, and that began to get me more into these texts. And I think at the same time, I was very much, I'd been reading Mary Carruthers' work very intensively at that time. And one of the things that I became convinced about was that in Mary Carruthers' work, which is really foundational in all kinds of ways, there's a tendency, I think, always to convert the verbal into the visual. She's very much interested in the ways in which words on the page become pictures in the mind in the process of meditation. And one of the things that I became convinced of as I read more and more into the materials that I've written and talked about today is that there is something that is very stubbornly textual and verbal in these texts. They have a kind of textuality that cannot just be resolved into visual images. That the meditative engagement with this kind of devotional writing is not simply a question of visualizing scenes in the mind. That's obviously a part of it, but it's actually opening yourself up to the kind of physical rhythms of language and the effects that that has. And that is something that I hope I've made very prominent in the book. And I suppose it also comes from the fact that at heart I'm a philologist by trade, a literary person. I wanted to sort of show that there is something to the understanding of these devotional materials that literary people can actually bring to their understanding, which perhaps people who work in other disciplines aren't quite so aware of. So I hope that, that's been I hope that what I'm offering is with this focus on text and verbality is a kind of contribution to a sort of collective understanding of this kind of devotional to this kind of devotional writing. Insofar as all of the texts that I've talked about do appear to have a very wide transmission, especially when they go into the vernacular. I mean, they have big circulations. Bonaventure has a wide circulation in all kinds of religious orders among clergy, regular and monastic, regular and secular clergy. He also has a very wide transmission in Devotional Moderna circles, which then also begins to produce a kind of dissemination into lay circles as well. The same goes for Suso, especially through the vernacular translations, that there is a very strong transmission there through Dominican networks, obviously, and Carthusian networks. Also in the Devotional Moderna, Suso is one of the kind of top 10 Devotional Moderna recommended texts. He's right in that letter at the beginning that I mentioned by Gerd Grote, in which he's encouraging a young man not to go away and study at university. He tells this young man to read the death chapter from Suso several times over. That'll cure him of any desire to go to university, apparently. So they are in fact reaching all social classes, and the manuscript provenances, insofar as we can establish them, show that. There is this wordplay in the cordiale. I get the impression that it comes about almost in spite of itself, just by dint of this piling on of repetition. I don't get the sense reading cordiale that Gerard of Vliederhofen was a particularly sort of literary or sort of playful talent. What he does is, the whole thing is just really this collage of assembled citations that he's culled from all kinds of other sources. But it's based on this constant principle of repetition and reiteration. And it seems to me that the semantic richness of individual words comes about almost just by dint of this repetition. If you just keep piling on the verb humiliare with enough references to earth and things like that, this playfulness comes about of itself. I suspect that in Gerard's case, it isn't a kind of intentional or premeditated kind of literary playfulness, but it's more, that it is more a kind of a side effect of this, this technique of repeating and reiterating, which he does, over and over again. I mean, every one of the discourses really consists of repeated exemplar, all exemplifying the same thing. constantly reiterated maxims and sententiae that always hammer home the same message. And they, just by dint of sheer repetition, they produce this kind of semantic layering and thickening. I think, I'm not sure if that's that would be my hunch, I guess, about what that is in the cordiale. Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think that what happens in the cordiale is that this is a text in which its form becomes realized in performance, that what you have is a compositional principle, which is repetition. I mean, everything that, as I was saying in reply to Ada's, everything that Gerard does is just to repeat. You know, you have a sententia and you just iterate it and iterate it and iterate it, and then you flesh it out with an exemplum, and then you just add another and add another and add another, and you just keep coming back to you keep coming back to these things. So you have this compositional principle of repetition, and then in the actual performed reading of the text, what that becomes is a sensation of rhythm. And I think it's precisely in that performance of the rhythm, as you read and feel this somatically, that what happens there is that it's almost as though the kind of form, that the repetition becomes converted into the form of the text, or realizes itself in this dynamic temporal performance. I don't know if that's quite answering the question, but certainly I can see that's how I think of prokessos, and I can see how that could have links to notions of exposition and dramatic performance. I'm not sure I've answered that as sharply as you might have hoped for, but I hope that gets somewhere. Does the semantic layering continue? It just continues. I think that's what that's what I would say. It simply continues, that you get to this graveyard scene. I've excerpted a great deal, of course, to fit these things onto slides and highlight the points that were most relevant to me. You get poured into this a whole kind of slew of ubi sunt topoi. They go on for several pages. And through that, through that, the reader is constantly kind of being made to identify with the dead. Where are they? They are dead. They are worms. They are returned to earth, just like you. So it continues, I would say, just in this vein, through this concatenation of ubi sunt topoi.
We have a couple more minutes in our time slot if anyone has any other questions that they would like to pose. I guess I can take a minute to just say that throughout your entire talk, Mark, I couldn't get Dante out of my mind, I must say. So I'm really glad when you did mention Dante, and especially during the discussion of Bonaventure and his soliloquy. Anyways, yes, it made me wonder really how much Dante was engaging with this sort of literature, especially Bonaventure, who just preceded him by not too many years, I know.
I guess both the soliloquium and another scheme of devotional exercises by Bonaventure, the so-called threefold way, the De Triplici Via, had a very wide manuscript transmission. So I think it is. I'm not Danteist enough to know whether it's documented that he might have read these things. What is certainly known, isn't it, is that in Florence in the 1290s, he was probably attending the public debates at the Franciscan convent. That's quite well documented. That he has a quite serious engagement with Franciscan thought. So I think it's not implausible that he would have known these devotional texts by Bonaventure, which, I mean, they certainly have a very wide, very broad manuscript diffusion. Whether there are textual reminiscences, I'm not Dantist enough to know, I'm afraid.
Yeah, neither am I. Okay, well, I think that we have exhausted both our time slot and the questions. So I would like to thank you again one more time for coming to speak with us over Zoom. Your talk was wonderful, very stimulating. And for the audience, we will be posting this video on the Medieval Studies website so that you can go back and review it. And if you know anyone who wasn't able to make it to our talk today, please feel free to direct them there. But I would like to ask people to clap remotely for Dr. Chinca, even though, you know, he won't be able to hear all of you, but...
I am reading in the chat, I am reading your...
Oh yes, yes.
The virtual auditory experience of your very kind reaction. Thank you so much.
Well, I will applaud vicariously for everyone else. How about?
Very kind. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me again.